Feisty one.
Who was that impression of?
In-betweeners.
Yeah,
Huh?
you're
The
lying.
In-betweeners.
Oh, the
Welcome to another potentially feisty episode of Livelunch. Our wonderful producer Jessica Loki has organised food from Mac Shack. And so we've got mac and cheese.
It's great. I'm a big fan.
What did you get with your mac and cheese?
This is like meatballs and tomato sauce. What's the new one?
Mushrooms.
Mushroom. Short store there.
Oh, I had spicy
Christine?
pepperoni.
Pepperoni.
Yeah. Well,
Well, mate,
I'm not the mushroom mac and cheese guy.
You come in late. That's what you get.
Fair play. Sorry. Anyway.
Hi everyone.
Hi everyone. We had Matt Carvel speak to us this Sunday from a strange story on so many levels.
Yeah, at
from
the Climate
Genesis,
Centre, different
the
pictures
Climate-
another
of
sides.
course.
Yep.
And different pictures at the other side. But if you watched the video online, it would have been Matt Carvel. So Matt, you want to give us a quick summary? And, welcome Christine Liddiard. Good to have you back with us. One of my favorite regulars. So welcome Christine.
Thank you.
Matt, do you want to do a summary of the preach?
Yeah, I can do. I think this is, in many ways, let's just say a problematic passage. It's got a lot of problematic elements to it. And so I was tried to be very clear from the word go with the message that this is a descriptive passage and this is not holding up an example of how family life should be, and quite the opposite. And so I just want to reiterate that again. What we have here is Jacob being very much the opposite of what a man should be in terms of the way and he and Laban treat Rachel and Leah. We have this situation where Jacob is with them because he has run away from the other family that is already blown up because of his deception and heads into this other situation, meets Rachel, wants to marry her. Laban, Rachel's father, sees this as an opportunity to exploit for his own gain and tricks Jacob into marrying Rachel's sister Leah, who's the older sister, and Jacob ends up marrying both of them. And so I kind of looked at the different characters, Jacob and Rachel and Leah, and things from their perspective and how they have been treated. And I suppose where we got to is just really countering that with how Jesus speaks to, in John chapter 4, the Samaritan woman that he meets at the well, Jacob's well, as it's called. You see that in John 4:6. And this gives us the counterexample in the passage of Genesis 29. Very much, Rachel and Leah are mistreated. They're treated as objects. They're treated as property, and that is not the way they should have been treated. And Jesus shows us that in his interaction with the Samaritan woman, in a context that he should not have really been seen to speak to her. Jesus does away with the labels and the social dominant perspective and say, no, actually you are someone made in the image of God with inherent dignity, value and worth. And Jesus speaks to her on that basis, and we see really a transformation and in her. And like Rachel, she had lost dignity. Like Leah, she had been the unfavored one. She was divorced several times, but Jesus doesn't doesn't condemn. And actually, we see a wonderful gospel moment of actually through that life-changing conversation that Jesus has with her, even many other people come to faith. And, as a gospel, they believed in Jesus because of her going and saying to them, hey, come and see this person that's told me everything. So she's so empowered by the conversation.
I thought that the bit that he spoke about the Samaritan woman was such a unique perspective. I must confess, I hadn't heard a perspective like that on the Samaritan woman. So when Jesus asked how many, bring your husband, and the conversation ended up with her saying she's like 5 or 6 husbands or previous partners, and then you rightly pointed out that she'd been a woman that was rejected so many times. So in some way the narrative spun from her being potentially somebody who had rejected a lot of men or treated men and moved on to the next man, to being somebody who was constantly rejected And that's the kind of person that Jesus went after, and then used.
Because she would have been seen that way at the time. And I think we have to be honest with ourselves when we read bits like that, and we think of her as being an immoral person.
Yes.
Or we think even of this passage, Genesis 29, Jacob gets tricked, and I think it's not really about Jacob's the perpetrator. Who's the victim here? Who's this about? I mean, I have to give credit to someone else. Was it you, or is it someone else in our preaching meeting in terms of bringing in that women at the well? Did you mention it?
I think so. I don't know.
It sounds like something different.
I don't want to take the credit for what someone else said.
Either yourself or Toby that mentioned that the Samaritan woman gives a great parallel.
I think it was Toby.
The narrative that we often read, even in popular press at the moment, is a series of separate stories, but famous men who've been abusive to their wives, partners, women, and potentially beating the judicial system. Now, we're not saying this is not a conversation about whether they are innocent or guilty. But you're raising some helpful points about, when we, especially with our children, the kind of role models that are presented before them, going deeper into that. You made a really good point.
Yeah, I think let's be honest. We live in a very ungodly culture, and it can be easy for us to minimize the pain and the destruction that sin creates in our world, and it's easy even for us to see what we say and just shrug it off and normalize. Oh, well, these just happen. Men just are like that. Oh, people get treated badly, or people are promiscuous, and isn't it? Well, it doesn't really matter. But I really believe it matters to God, and I really believe this thing matters to God. When you think what's God's emotive reaction to the way that Rachel and Leah were treated. I mean, that's what I tried to communicate in the message, because we can forget about that. Like, how we treat one another really is important to God. I mean, we see that in the life of Jesus. I don't think there's many other things more important apart from our relationship with him. Jesus said, you'll be known by the love that you have for each other. And often, even as Christians, we can think about, well, I love my family, or, I love my friends that I hang out with. But Jesus said, no, as a community, the way that you love one another, which when we're talking about loving, we're talking about the way we talk to one another, the way we listen to one another, treat one another. And so it's radical what Jesus says to us. And I think what can happen is that because we are in an environment where there's so much, as I say, normalization of poor treatment of one another and not valuing of other people, and this an individualism that is sometimes unchallenged and unquestioned by people. Breakups just happen. Well, people just get created. Well, that's just the way it is. But I'm not saying we need to go and start a moral campaign against society. That's not going to be productive. But for us as the church, we need to reflect on our behavior and our attitude. How am I treating the men in my life, the women in my life, whether they are my wife, husband, children, but friend that I meet at church, person that I meet in the shop. God calls us to something greater.
I think because some of these things get brushed under the carpet. You were talking about somebody who paid somebody off so they didn't need to go to court. We can think it's over and done with, but it's never over and done with for that woman and the consequences for her life. And we see that in this passage and the passages to come. We're going to get baby wars next, where, being two wives in the same family has set up this awful competition and hatred between two sisters where that should never have been there. We can forget that behaviour has consequences, and those consequences can be terrible and they can be lifelong. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important we don't talk lightly about these kind of things because of that.
It'll be really good to talk about this next week. Is the whole, you do come across on social media and on Instagram that a big push towards having open relationships and open marriages. And again, there's another famous Hollywood couple that have an open marriage where, they partner with different people.
Yeah.
And we don't really go into, is that a destructive pattern? What does that do to the relationship, to the individuals involved? Maybe one for next week, where we really get into open relationships and is this a good thing? Is this okay? Just because some people on Instagram are saying, yeah, look, it's books to us and we're all really happy. Is this actually a good thing? Is this something worth practicing? Or why shouldn't we? But let's do that next week.
Let's talk about that. I think it'll probably be a couple of weeks' time, because we've got gift
Day
campaign
next Sunday.
Next Sunday.
I think, go after you.
I was just going to say, I think, I hope it's not too controversial to say. Let's to talk specifically about men and women and valuing of one another and that sort of thing. I think this passages like this, and when we talk about these issues, they're hopefully a great reminder. Because I can sort of say on Sunday, we need to value one another and dignify one another. But perhaps we don't often talk about what that actually means and what that actually looks like. And probably it's helpful to say that we actually all have to learn what that means. If you're a man and speaking to a woman, you need to understand what is actually going to give her value and dignity, because probably the way that you think it might, if you are thinking might not be the same thing. And I think it's important as a community that we start having these conversations and talking about what does it mean to value one another, and show dignity to one another. Because sometimes we can say, there's opportunity to do this, and you do this, and we do this, and look, you're doing this, so you're valued. But if people are not feel like they're listened to, or that their opinions are not taken on board, or that sort of thing, that can be a massive part of what it means to be valued. And I think in this, I raised that point because in this passage, I made the point, like, Rachel doesn't get a voice. She doesn't get asked. And that's not a good thing. And in contrast to the earlier passage, when Rebecca does get asked whether she wants to marry Isaac. And that's empowering to her to be asked and that sort of thing. And so I think, we as, speakers, leaders, elders in the church can say we don't always get this right, but I think we are trying to always reflect on this and do this. And I raised the point about the preaching team. I think it's important that we have a preaching team. I get the credit for a Sunday when it goes well, but the first thing I tried to say to people is actually a lot of this content was brought out in a group of people with different life experiences, men and women, and I think the more we can do that, the more healthy it is. The more I would just want to serve people as well as we can do with what we say on Sunday. There's a little rant there.
I think, Christine, we've talked about the value and the dignity of women. If you are being honest, how should we be doing that in church? And if we aren't doing it well, how and where could we do it better?
That's a big question.
Matt's had his rant, so your turn.
Christine doesn't rant.
Well, let me just tell you my reaction to the sermon on Sunday. I actually shed a tear because I felt like I'd not really heard a sermon like that really affirmed women in that way so explicitly. And I think that is part of the problem, is that we're not necessarily explicit enough. We're not articulating that value and worth. And women who are in a church where there is predominantly a male leadership that do most of the speaking, for example, can infer, there isn't a place for me, or I'm not allowed to speak, or I shouldn't. and that's not right, but it can be inferred. And I think that it's so good that we just keep articulating the value and worth of men and women, and to talk about our primary relationship with each other is as brother and sister. And I think that takes it out of the men-women thing a bit. But there should be love between us, appropriate love between us. There should be encouragement and maybe advocacy. Sometimes, women can feel like, I have got something to say, but I've got such a tiny voice and I don't know how to do it. And sometimes we need to come alongside one another. I know people have done that for me in this church. And I don't think I would be doing what I do now if it were not for some of the elders who have stood by me, encouraged me, metaphorically held my hand when I do a talk for the first time or things like that. There's just been a culture of encouragement that I have experienced.
Brilliant.
I know I'm one person, but we should all be seeking to do that with one another.
What would you say to other women who are, in some ways, you've often been on stage and you've brought significant contributions, prophetic contributions. So even at the gathering last Thursday, you came in and closed the show really and got the biggest cheer of the evening. And I think a lot of us could look up to you as a role model of somebody who's doing really well as a woman at Emmanuel. What would you say to some of the other women or younger women who are looking up to you? What encouragement would you give them?
Get your Bible out. Know your Bible. Love God. First and foremost. Other things are secondary to that. They don't feel like it, but they're secondary. Get that right. Get your attitudes right. Serve. Just keep serving. And I think that might feel like it's a bit low key, but actually I think that I hope that what I do comes out of that and not a sense of striving for role or visibility. And it's a wanting to serve God. And obviously with the prophetic of hearing him. And to be honest, it's still quite scary at times. As it should be, actually, for all of us, that if we're going to prophesy to the church, that we need to have a real reverence for God in that. But I would get alongside other women, get women to mentor you. If you feel you've got a particular gifting, talk to people about it, talk to the elders about it, find out where you can get encouragement and help to develop that gift.
Absolutely brilliant.
If I can add to that as well, I think because in saying what we're saying today, I would definitely say that Christine has helped me to understand this better, and that that thing that I was talking about in terms of learning how to value one another only really comes from listening to other people. And so we've had many conversations where Christine said, Matt, when you say that, this is what is heard, and that is so helpful. And all this thing that Christine is saying there about I know where she's coming from is she wants us to get this word in front of people, and wants, her heart is that people get close to God, and there's no barriers in the way, and they're inspired to do that. So that helps me, I know that's where she's coming from with it.
Yeah, and can I say that there have been times when I've cried talking to you, haven't there? There have been times where, as women, sometimes we find it very hard to articulate things, and that also stops us from saying them because we get very emotionally involved with it. Sometimes I've felt passionate about things, or I've just felt maybe offended by something, but it's been fine to talk to Matt like that. And he can take that, and he still accepts me, and that is tremendously freeing as well, because we will relate to one another differently. We are men and women, and we will communicate in different ways. But I think sometimes that can hold women back. You're thinking, I'm going to get emotional. But actually, if it's part of your makeup, then, you need to be able to do that somewhere.
I'm sorry. This sounds really bad. I was going to say I can totally empathize. I can't totally empathize. I know in conversations with my wife, she's a very good communicator and can articulate her arguments really well. And I struggle and I can feel emotional, and I default to emotions.
Yeah.
And she can hold her ground because she knows she can communicate really well and articulate what she's and quite often she can articulate better than me what my own concept is and my own thing. So definitely leaning in on people's gifting, and not just not seeing it as a men and women thing, but a relation thing.
Yeah.
I don't think we can overemphasize that aspect of raising points and giving feedback. I don't think I have ever regretted hearing from anyone even if they're challenging me on something. Now that doesn't mean that I'm always going to agree.
I'll challenge you on the shoes that you wear when you preach, but you just totally ignored it. As you will.
But I think that sometimes when you're at the front and leading lots of staff and speaking lots of things and you're saying stuff with real conviction, some people get the impression that you know what you want to say and you don't want to hear from people. And I think so for me to sort of keep emphasizing, actually, when people's, can I just raise this? And have you thought about this? And you said this and I heard this. And sometimes that's, I think I don't agree with it, or sometimes it's not fair, or sometimes, you didn't talk about being emotional there. I've had plenty of conversations that are emotional from men and women, and it looks different. And sometimes it's aggressive, and so, but I guess what I try to do is actually to listen and try to understand, because even if there are things that it's never going to be the case that I'm going to disagree with everything, and a lot of the time, even when people are criticizing or saying things that they think should change, or things are not right about either what I've said or what we do as a church, that sort of thing. In the vast majority of cases, there's probably about 75% of what they're saying I agree with, and also have the same frustration. And maybe there's parts of it that I don't agree with. But I do want to encourage that, because I'm trying to look upon that and say, okay, is this an opportunity for me to learn how things are heard, learn how things are perceived and come across, and whether that's the men and women thing. I mean, we talked in previous messages about the sort of race thing, and different people, different backgrounds, different perspectives, and again, a lot of it can be done to do with, if this is communicated, and there's a large part that's not communicated, what people hear in the absence, and sometimes people think that we believe or would say stuff that's like, no, of course we don't say that, but we don't say. And so that's why I've tried to be with my preaching, just be like,
so the
just
moral
very
of
direct with it.
Is if you have feedback for Matt, other than his shoes, please bring it to him,
or including
my
shoes.
Receive it.
That's fine.
Well, you haven't changed your shoes, have you? It's not that you will change. You will have a good response. I think just going back into what this is really a practical pastoral question. Somebody who's watched the preach. It's, I think, too, for a daughter who probably has felt betrayed by parental authority, or let down, or find herself in a situation not because of her own doing. And I guess the second part is for a father who's probably not treated his children well, and is kind of living with, it's been the weight of that decision, or the guilt of that decision, or those decisions in the past, maybe ongoing, I don't know, that they're now living with. We've heard, come to Jesus, he doesn't reject you, he restores you, he renews you. You can find restoration, you can find forgiveness, you can find grace in Jesus. And great. Not no one's saying, well, how do we move on from that? But then what next for the individual, both the daughter and the father, who've been challenged or convicted by what they heard in the preach?
Ready to go first?
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I hope that that if there is that sense of resonance on either side with this passage, whether in terms of the victim or the perpetrator, whichever one we might relate to, that there is some sense of hope for them from what we said on Sunday, because I think with Christ with Christ there is hope even in the darkest situations. Now, I think as Christine was mentioning, I can't remember if you said this just now or before we started filming, but the impact of sin is long lasting, and sometimes we do live with the consequences of sin for the rest of our lives until Christ comes again and makes everything new. You know, that's one of the things when when Jesus comes again, every tear will be taken away, and that gives a sense of like the flip side of that is in this life, even though we do experience a restoring work of Jesus and can know his love in a real and tangible way that changes us, that work of change and transformation isn't complete until we see Christ face to face. So I think we live in a time where there is the consequences of sin and the brokenness of the world, but with the real hope and power of Christ's work now. So in things like Thrive Story, which is running at the minute, the whole tone of that is for some people processing and dealing with things that have happened in the past, either things they've done or have done to them. And in many cases, at the time, they might have said, I forgive you, or received a forgiveness, received someone's forgiveness, or have, became a Christian and knew God's love, and that changed everything. But they're still realizing that it has affected them in a certain way. And sometimes we don't quite at first realize the depth of the gospel and the depth of the way God changes us, that actually takes decades rather than just just a moment. And so hopefully there's hope, but there's also a process in change and dealing with these things, and especially when it comes to things to do with family, they can strike the deepest, can't they?
They can. I think we see in this story too women who have to collude with their father and their husband, and that kind of touches on the whole situation of abuse in the home, whether it's domestic abuse or as we would understand between spouses, or a parental abuse. And I think the thing to say to people is come and talk to us, because we will listen. And it's something that we deal with as a pastoral team and have dealt with, but we will listen and we will advocate for people in difficult situations. That's not to make judgments about who's right and who's wrong, but we will stand with people through situations to come through to the other side. And it will be a long journey in those sort of situations, because as I said earlier, the hurts go deep and it's very enmeshed kind of relationships. But the church is here for you. We are here for one another.
Brilliant. That's really good.
What a hopeful note to finish on.
Yeah.
Should we finish there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks. So I think practical note, sign up for Thrive Story. Are we doing it again next time if you're part of Emmanuel?
No.
Oh, we're not doing it next time.
We will be doing it again in January. We tend to do it once or twice a year.
Not in the autumn term.
No, but you could join a Thrive study group.
Yeah.
You can indeed.
Great. Thanks so much for joining us. We will see you next week. What do we have coming up?
Well, it's gift campaign day.
Gift campaign
Day. No, Sunday. Well, we're taking a specific Sunday in our gift campaign, which is all of this month, to preach directly to what we're involved in terms of giving money to the church plants that we're involved in Belfast and Bath and Krakow. So Neville Jones is going to be speaking to us, giving us a bit of an update from how those churches are getting on, and then speaking to us from one of Jesus' parables, and to encourage us to give into that.
Will we have Neville on Livelunch?
We can ask the question, can't we?
Exciting. Cool. Thanks so much. See you next week.
See ya.
Bye.